this is what color revolutions are. The CIA is all over these operations. Other U.S. institutions like the National Endowment for Democracy, the National Democratic Institute, the National Republican Institute, and so forth, work with the local media, work with groups that they create or that they fund to foment unrest. That's a standard playbook for such covert operations. They're not very covert, but they're called covert because the U.S. role is denied. Well, the government cracked down on these protests. No doubt there are local protesters, by the way, because people ask, that have many objections or disgruntlements with the government, no doubt. But the organization, the financing, the bussing in of people, the mass media, that doesn't happen spontaneously. And so the U.S. played its role. There was the crackdown. And then part of the game is, oh, when the crackdown comes, now we put on even more overt sanctions. So Obama declared an emergency, that Venezuela represented an emergency to U.S. national security. Can you imagine? We were so threatened by Venezuela. It was so dangerous. That's what Obama declared in 2015. He started the escalation of the sanctions. Then Trump came in 2017. Trump, being Trump, said, I don't get it. Why don't we just invade? And he had a dinner with Latin American presidents on the margin of the UN General Assembly in September 2017. And I've spoken with two presidents that were there at that dinner at some length, and they described exactly the scenario, both of them separately to me. And basically the scenario was that the presidents assembled, and then Trump said, why don't I just invade Venezuela? And they were shocked by this, and they explained, Mr. President, maybe that wouldn't be such a great idea. Maybe it would be a little complicated. There might be a backlash. It could result in chaos. It could result in millions of refugees. It could result in big loss of life. In Latin America, there's a lot of anti-Americanism, anti-US sentiment. It would stoke that. So they tried to talk him down from this. And Trump said, okay, I'll just crush the Venezuelan economy. So what began was a ratcheting up of punitive economic measures, confiscating Venezuela's foreign exchange reserves, freezing Venezuela's accounts, designating PDVSA as an entity under sanction so that other companies couldn't do business with Venezuela. And the U.S. tools are varied and many, and we have a number of emergency acts, especially the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the IEEPA, which gives the executive branch essentially unbridled authority to impose a very wide range of financial sanctions, cutting off the economy from the dollar-based payment system. So for most of the world, doing international business involves using dollars as the medium of exchange and doing it through international banks that facilitate the payments and settlements of an international transaction. And because these are dollar-based transactions, ultimately they involve dollar accounts of U.S. banks held with the U.S. Federal Reserve. And so the U.S. can impose a blockade, a choke point on payments for international trade. For example, on Venezuela's ability to receive dollars for the oil that it exports, or the ability of PDVSA, the oil company, to pay for repairs for operations in the oil fields. So Trump imposed extraordinarily comprehensive and very tough sanctions on Venezuela. And between 2016 and 2020, oil production collapsed by about 3/4. That's the physical flow of oil. And since that's Venezuela's essentially only export, the Venezuelan economy collapsed. The currency collapsed. The inflation soared. The ability to make imports collapsed. The standard of living collapsed. And according to the data of the International Monetary Fund, for example, the national output per person fell by about 2/3 between 2016 and 2020. That's worse than a war. That is a cataclysm. That's not a downturn. That is a destruction of the economy. Of course, Trump did many other things that were seemingly farcical, but were not treated as farce. He named a different president. Suddenly, one day, the White House said, no, Mr. Maduro's not president. It's Juan Guaido. So we all scratched our heads. Who's Juan Guaido? Oh, he's in the National Assembly. And the U.S. just picked him out, said he's the legitimate president. And you might think this is a comic book, this is a joke, but it had two implications. One is that the U.S. used its economic sanctions to say they now belong to Mr. Guaido. This could hold from the U.S. unilateral point of view. The U.S. said in the IMF, it's Mr. Guaido that gets to appoint the executive director and so forth. So the U.S., by using its power, just declared a different president. And the second point was about 60 other countries, basically vassals of the U.S., that means Europe, and others said, oh, yes, Mr. Guaido is president now, in a way you can't even imagine. Okay, fast forward to this past year, Trump just decided, now we're going to invade. We've crushed the economy. We've put on the sanctions. We've weakened the regime. We're just going to invade. And all of our so disheartening mainstream media, like the New York Times, says, well, there's so much unhappiness about the Maduro regime, and people are suffering, and they don't explain one word about what the root causes are. I don't know whether they're just utterly ignorant, utterly bought out, whether the reporters, God knows who they work for. But the point is, they don't understand or tell the story. Iran is the same story, of course, played out in a very different context. But the U.S. has been imposing comprehensive economic sanctions on Iran for now, actually decades. But when Trump came in to power again in the second term, one of the first actions was to take extra steps to crush the Iranian economy. And the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, who is there, I think, mainly because he is willing to use the U.S. Treasury to crush other countries, invoked the emergency operations mechanisms. Trump gave the order that Venezuela constituted an emergency. And as Bessent explained in an interview to Fox Business on January 20th, just a few weeks ago in Davos, Trump ordered the crushing of the Iranian economy. And OFAC, which is the part of the U.S. Treasury that operates the sanctions, went to work to basically bring down the Iranian currency by cutting off Iran from any remaining dollar-based transactions internationally. And you tell banks all over the world, if you do any business directly or indirectly with Iranian entities, we will sanction you. You may be 5,000 miles away just facilitating a trade transaction, but we're coming after you. And that's how extraterritorial sanctions by the US are enforced. And what Besant says in this interview is quite remarkable. He says, we went out to crush the economy, and by December, it worked. The currency plummeted. The dollars ran out. There were shortages of dollars, and people came out onto the streets because of this, Besant says. And then he says, this is all moving in a very positive way. So the cynicism of it is extraordinary. Of course, go to the New York Times, go to the Washington Post, go to the Wall Street Journal. What is the narrative there? That people came out onto the streets to protest the corruption and mismanagement of their regime. And what is amazing for me, Glenn, is that even after the U.S. Treasury Secretary explained it, for those people who know the Wizard of Oz, when the dog Toto pulls the curtain aside and exposes the wizard as some old guy speaking into a megaphone, even after the game is exposed, no mainstream medium reported it. Nobody had an article saying, oh, this is why people came out onto the streets. This is the reason for the protests. This was a U.S. game. This is a U.S. regime change operation. Not even noted. Even after it's explained gleefully with that grin on the face of the Treasury Secretary, not discussed. So that's the background as I see it. This is regime change, top to bottom. This is economic instruments, and the U.S. has them because of the role of the dollar in the international system and the fact that the U.S. alone of any country essentially controls the IMF because it alone has the veto. And I like to remind people, the World Bank is on 18th Street and Pennsylvania Avenue, 1 block away from the executive office of the president, 2 blocks away from the White House, and 3 blocks away from the Treasury. And the IMF is 1 block further on. And so it is the row of U.S. international power to crush other governments.